Charles Whitman, millionaire, had everything money could buy. His mansion, nestled in an exclusive neighborhood, was the epitome of luxury, complete with crystal chandeliers, antique furniture, and priceless art collections. Despite all this opulence, Charles felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness. He had no real friends, no one who cared for him beyond his wealth. The people around him were either employees or acquaintances who valued him for his fortune. What Charles craved was something far more elusive, a genuine connection with someone who liked him for who he was, not for his money. One evening, as he sat alone in his grand dining room, staring at a meal prepared by his personal chef, Charles made a decision that would change his life. He would leave his life of luxury behind, at least temporarily, and live as an ordinary person. Near identity, he could find someone who would appreciate him for his character, not his bank account. Charles devised a plan. He would move to a small town where no one knew him, and he would adopt a new identity, Charlie Smith, a retiree looking to live a quiet life. He would live modestly in a simple house and blend in with the local community. There, he would start his search for a true friend. Charles arrived in Meadowbrook, a quaint town where everyone seemed to know each other. It was the perfect place for him to start fresh. He rented a small, cozy house on the edge of town, far removed from the grandeur he was accustomed to. His new home had no butlers or maids, just the basic necessities. It was a stark contrast to the life he had left behind, but Charles found comfort in the simplicity. As Charlie Smith, he began to frequent the local spots, the grocery store, the town park, and a small cafe where the townspeople gathered for coffee and conversation. It was at this cafe that he met Emily, a young and lively barista who had a warm smile for everyone. Emily was in her mid-20s with a curious mind and a friendly demeanor. She quickly took an interest in the quiet newcomer and made it a point to engage him in conversation whenever he came by. One afternoon, while Charlie was enjoying a coffee at the cafe, a commotion outside caught his attention. An elderly man, George, had tripped and fallen on the sidewalk. Without hesitation, Charlie rushed to help him, lifting George up and making sure he was all right. The incident drew the attention of other patrons who murmured in surprise at the kindness of the newcomer. As George thanked Charlie, the two men struck up a conversation. George was a retired teacher, well known and respected in tea. He was grateful for Charlie's help and invited him to sit down and chat. Over the next few weeks, Charlie and George began to meet regularly, their conversations growing deeper as they shared stories of their lives. However, Charlie's actions didn't go unnoticed by everyone. Some in the town began to wonder who this new man was. His generosity and quiet demeanor stood out, leading to whispers and speculation about his past. But for the first time in a long while, Charlie felt like he was starting to form a genuine connection with both Emily and George. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that his true identity might be revealed, threatening the very thing he sought to find. As the days in Meadowbrook turned into weeks, Charlie found himself spending more time with Emily. She was a bright spot in his new life, and their conversations grew longer and more personal with each passing day. Emily had a way of making everyone around her feel comfortable, and Charlie was no exception. She would often share little stories from her life, gradually revealing her struggles and dreams in a way that made Charlie feel trusted and valued. One afternoon, as they sat in the cafe, sipping coffee and watching the townspeople go about their day, Emily opened up about her life. "I've always wanted to leave Meadowbrook," she admitted, her voice tinged with a mix of hope and resignation. "But it's hard, you know? My mom is here, and she needs me. And with the way things are, I can't afford to just pack up and go." Charlie listened intently, sensing the weight of her words. He could see the flicker of dreams in her eyes, the desire for something more. Yet he also saw the burden she carried, something he could relate to, though in a very different way. "I understand," he said softly, his mind drifting back to his own past. The life he had lived, surrounded by luxury but devoid of true companionship, now felt like a gilded cage. He had always prioritized his business, his wealth, over relationships. And now, here he was, trying to understand what it truly meant to connect with someone, As Emily spoke, Charlie's mind wandered back to moments from his previous life. He remembered the countless business deals, the high-stakes meetings, and the extra, but what stood out most were the times when he was alone, sitting in his massive study, surrounded by books and documents, yet feeling an overwhelming sense of emptiness. Those were the moments when he would look at his reflection in the grand mirror and wonder if all his success was worth the solitude it brought. These flashbacks were sobering. They made him realize just how much he had sacrificed for his wealth, the relationships he had neglected, the friendships that never formed because he was always too busy, too focused on the next big deal. Now in Meadowbrook, he was starting to see the value in the simple connections he was forming. It was a revelation that both comforted and terrified him. In the quiet of his small rented home, Charlie often found himself lost in thought. He would sit by the window, watching the sun set over the town, and engage in silent conversations with himself. Was this new? Could he really keep up this facade? Or would the truth eventually come out? More importantly, should he tell Emily who he really was? These questions haunted him, especially when he was with Emily. There were moments when he wanted to confess everything, to tell her about Charles Whitman, the millionaire who had everything but was still lonely. Yet, every time he came close, something held him back. The fear of losing the genuine connection they had built. Charlie's presence in Meadowbrook was beginning to have a ripple effect. His kindness and unassuming nature were winning people over, and soon, he was no longer just the mysterious newcomer, but a beloved member of the community. He and George had become close friends, their bond deepening with each shared story and memory. George, a war veteran with a life full of both hardship and triumph, often shared tales from his past. His eyes would light up as he recounted his adventures, but there was always a hint of sadness when he spoke of the friends he had lost and the life he had left behind. Charlie admired George's resilience, his ability to find joy despite everything he had endured. It was something Charlie was beginning to learn for himself, how to find meaning in the simple, everyday moments. One evening, after their usual walk in the park, George invited Charlie over for dinner. As they sat together eating a simple meal in George's modest home, the conversation turned to matters of the heart. "Life's funny," George mused, his voice gruff but warm. "You can have all the money in the world, but if you don't have someone to share it with, it doesn't mean much." Charlie nodded, the truth of those words resonating deeply with him. It was exactly what he had been grappling with, the realization that all his wealth was meaningless without true connections. Emily, meanwhile, had noticed a change in Charlie. He seemed more introspective, more reserved than when they first met. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something, but she didn't want to pry. Her trust in him was strong, and she valued their friendship too much to risk it by pressing him for answers. Still, there were moments when she would catch him staring off into the distance, lost in thought, and she would wonder what was going on behind those kind eyes. Despite her concerns, Emily chose to believe in Charlie. She told herself that everyone had their secrets, and whatever his might be, it didn't change the person she had come to know and care for. The dynamics of these new relationships were so different from the ones Charlie had known in his previous life. There was no pretense, no ulterior motives, just genuine care and companionship. It was both refreshing and frightening for Charlie, who was used to people wanting something from him. But in Meadowbrook, all they wanted was his company, and that was something he was more than willing to give. Charlie had always prided himself on maintaining control, but the more time he spent with Emily, the more that control began to slip. His feelings for her were growing stronger, and with that came an overwhelming fear. What if she found out who he really was? What if the bond they had built was shattered by the truth? He found himself in a constant state of anxiety. Every moment with Emily was bittersweet, filled with joy but also shadowed by the looming threat of discovery. Charlie knew he was in deep when he realized he was falling in love with her. It was a terrifying realization because it meant that everything was now at stake. He had come to Meadowbrook seeking genuine connections, and he had found that in Emily, but at the cost of a lie that grew heavier with each passing day. The small town, with its close-knit community, was beginning to feel more like a trap than a refuge. People were starting to ask questions, subtle at first, but growing in intensity. "So, Charlie, where did you live before coming to Meadowbrook? What did you do for work?" The questions seemed innocent, but to Charlie they were landmines. Each one had the potential to expose his carefully crafted facade. One day, as he and Emily strolled through the park, she brought up something that made "Charlie, you never really talk about your past. I mean, I get it, everyone has things they'd rather not share, but sometimes it feels like you're hiding something. I just want to know more about you." Her words were gentle, but they struck Charlie like a hammer. He could see the concern in her eyes, the desire for honesty, but how could he tell her the truth? How could he explain that the man she knew as Charlie Smith was actually Charles Whitman, a man who had lived a life of unimaginable The thought of losing her trust, of seeing disappointment replace the warmth in her eyes, was unbearable. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said, forcing a smile. "It's just complicated. Maybe one day I'll be able to tell you everything, but for now, can we just enjoy what we have?" Emily nodded, but Charlie could see that his answer didn't satisfy her. The unease between them was growing, and Charlie knew that he couldn't keep up the charade forever. The conflict was becoming too much to bear, and he found himself standing at a crossroads. Continue the lie and risk everything, or tell the truth and face the consequences. Just when Charlie thought things couldn't get more complicated, a new threat emerged. It came in the form of a man named David Harris, a sharp-eyed investigative reporter known for uncovering scandals and secrets. David had been chasing a lead on the reclusive millionaire Charles Whitman for months, and his search had brought him to Meadowbrook. Charlie first heard about David's presence from George, who mentioned a stranger asking around town about a wealthy man who had seemingly vanished. Charlie's blood ran cold when George described the man's persistence and curiosity. It didn't take long for Charlie to connect the dots. David Harris was looking for him. The realization sent Charlie into a panic. He had been so careful, so meticulous in hiding his identity, but now it seemed his past was catching up to him. The walls were closing in, and Charlie knew he had little time before David put the pieces together. The breaking point came when Emily, who had noticed the tension in Charlie, decided to confront him directly. She had heard about the reporter and couldn't shake the feeling that Charlie was somehow connected to all of this. That evening, she went to his house, determined to get answer. "Charlie, I need to know the truth," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's a reporter in town asking questions about a millionaire who disappeared. Is there something you're not telling me?" Charlie felt his world crumbling around him. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was no turning back. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest, and looked into Emily's eyes. "Emily, there's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice shaking with the weight of the coffee. "My real name isn't Charlie Smith, it's Charles Whitman. I'm the man that reporter is looking for." For a moment, Emily just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock, hurt, and disbelief. "You lied to me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "All this time, you've been lying to me?" Charlie tried to explain, to make her understand why he had done it, but the words felt hollow even as they left his mouth. "I just wanted to find someone who would care about me, not my money," he said desperately. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Emily. I was going to tell you, I swear, but I was scared of losing you. But it was too late. The damage was done." Emily took a step back, tears welling up in her eyes. "I thought I knew you, Charlie. Or whoever you are. I trusted you. And now I don't know what to believe." Charlie reached out, but she recoiled, the pain and betrayal evident on her face. "I need time," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I need to think." She turned and walked away, leaving Charlie standing there, feeling more alone than he had ever felt in his life. The truth had come out, but instead of setting him free, it had trapped him in a new kind of isolation, one of his own making. Word spread quickly through Meadowbrook about the true identity of Charlie Smith. Charles Whitman, The millionaire, who had been living among them under a false name, was now the talk of tea. The news was met with a mix of shock, betrayal, and disbelief. For many, it was hard to reconcile the kind, humble man they had come to know with the wealthy and elusive figure who had hidden behind a mask of simplicity. George was one of the first to confront Charles. The old man's usually warm demeanor was replaced with an expression of hurt and anger. "I thought I had found a true friend in you, Charlie," George said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But now I see that even our friendship was B." Charles stood there, feeling the weight of his deception pressing down on him. "George, I never meant to hurt you," he began, but George cut him off. "You never meant to hurt anyone, but you did?" George replied, his tone firm. "You had the chance to be honest with us, but you chose to hide. Why? Because you didn't trust us? Or because you thought we wouldn't accept you if we knew who you really were?" Charles had no answer. He had been so consumed by his fear of rejection that he had never considered the possibility that people might accept him for who he was, regardless of his wealth. The confrontation with George was just the beginning. The townspeople, once friendly and welcoming, now regarded Charles with suspicion. Whispers followed him wherever he went, and he could feel the coldness in their gazes. It was as if a wall had gone up between him and the community, a wall that he had built himself with his lies. The hardest blow came when Emily, who had been avoiding him since their last conversation, finally approached him. She was composed, but Charles could see the pain in her eyes. "Why, Charlie? Why didn't you just tell me the truth?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "I was afraid, Emily," Charles admitted, his voice trembling. "I was afraid that if you knew who I really was, you wouldn't want anything to do with me. I wanted to be liked for who I am, not for my money." Emily shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "But you didn't give me the chance to decide that for myself. You took that choice away from me." With those words, Emily turned and walked away, leaving Charles standing alone in the middle of the street, feeling more isolated than ever. The very thing he had feared most had come to pass. He had lost the trust and friendship of the people he cared about most. Days passed, and Charles found himself sinking deeper into despair. The life he had built in Meadowbrook, the friendships he had cherished, all seemed to be crumbling around him. But as he sat alone in his small house reflecting on his actions, he realized that he couldn't let things end this way. If there was any chance of making things right, he had to take it. With renewed determination, Charles decided to face the community head-on. He arranged for a town meeting in the square, sending out word that he wanted to speak to everyone. When the day came, the square was filled with curious and cautious faces, all eager to hear what he had to say. Charles stood before them, feeling the weight of their expectations. Taking a deep breath, he began. "I know many of you feel hurt and betrayed by my actions, and you have every right to. I lied to you about who I am, and for that, I am truly sorry." He paused, looking around at the faces of the people he had come to care for. "The truth is, I came to Meadowbrook because I was lonely. I had everything money could buy, but I was missing something far more important: real friendships. I thought that if people knew me as Charles Whitman, they would only see the money and not the man. So I created Charlie Smith, hoping to find connections that were genuine." Charles's voice cracked with emotion as he continued. "But in doing so, I made a terrible mistake. I didn't trust you to accept me for who I really am. And in the process, I hurt the very people I wanted to be close to. I can't undo what I've done, but I can promise you this. From now on, I will be honest. No more lies, no more hiding. I just hope that in time you can find it in your hearts to forgive me." For a moment, there was silence. Then George stepped forward. His face was stern, but there was a softness in his eyes. "It takes a lot of courage to admit when you're wrong," George said, his voice gruff. "I won't lie, Charles. I'm still angry. But I've also seen the good in you. The man who helped a stranger off the street who became a friend when I needed one. Maybe we can find a way to rebuild that trust." Emily, who had been standing in the back, slowly made her way to the front. Her eyes were filled with tears, but there was also a glimmer of hope. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you yet," she said quietly. "But I do know that the man I got to know, the one who cared about people, that's the real you, and maybe, just maybe, we can start over." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd, and slowly the tension began to ease. The people of Meadowbrook, though hurt, were willing to give Charles a second chance. And as the meeting ended, Charles felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: relief. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, he was walking it with honesty and openness. Charles learned that true connections couldn't be built on lies, and that being vulnerable was a necessary part of forming real relationships. Over time, he worked to rebuild the trust he had lost, and though it wasn't easy, it was worth it. Emily and George, along with the rest of the town, gradually let him back into their lives, this time knowing exactly who he was. And for Charles, that was the greatest gift of all. Thank you for reading. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel and leave your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading your feedback.